On the night of June 1, 2009, an Airbus A330-203, painted in the signature blue and white of Air France, stood quietly on the tarmac of Rio de Janeiro Galeão International Airport in Brazil. The airport was alive with the familiar hum of late-night operations, baggage trucks rolling past, fuel trucks servicing aircraft, and the distant roar of other jets taking off into the tropical night. Inside the cabin, 228 passengers, some returning home, others beginning summer vacations, settled into their seats, fastened seatbelts, and began what was supposed to be a long but uneventful overnight flight across the Atlantic to Paris. The flight plan was standard, filed well in advance, with a clear route over the equatorial Atlantic, skirting regions known for thunderstorms but well within the operational capabilities of the Airbus A330. The aircraft itself was a reliable workhorse, introduced into Air France's fleet in the early 2000s. This A330 had flown thousands of hours safely, its systems meticulously maintained by the airline's engineering teams. It was equipped with the latest avionics for its time, automated flight systems, fly-by-wire controls, and redundant sensors designed to alert pilots to any anomaly. On paper, it was a routine flight, one of hundreds Air France operated each week in the cockpit. Captain Marc Dubois, a 58-year-old veteran pilot with over 11,000 flight hours, meticulously went through the pre-flight checks with the calm precision that years of experience bring. He had flown the A330 for over a decade, mastering its systems, understanding its responses in turbulence, and knowing how to manage its automated features. Alongside him were his two co-pilots, First Officer David Robert, 37, and First Officer Pierre Beau, 32. Both men had accumulated thousands of flight hours, though with less experience on this specific aircraft compared to Dubois. Together they formed a capable crew, accustomed to long-haul flights and cross-Atlantic operations. The departure from Rio proceeded normally, engines spooled to life. The aircraft taxied to runway 10, and at 11:59 p.m. the A330 lifted into the night sky. Below, the lights of Rio twinkled like a scattered constellation, the sprawling city disappearing quickly beneath the ascending jet. Inside, passengers glanced out of windows, noting the glowing coastline fading into darkness. Inside the cockpit, the mood was calm. Dubois maintained steady communication with Rio Tower, confirming the flight plan and ascent profile. The autopilot was engaged shortly after takeoff, allowing the crew to monitor systems as the aircraft climbed toward its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The first 2 hours of flight were unremarkable. The pilots performed routine checks, monitored weather reports, and ensured that the flight was maintaining its expected trajectory. Passengers, tired from their day's travel, began to sleep. Outside, the tropical night was serene, but the Atlantic was anything but predictable. Overhead, weather satellites had detected clusters of thunderstorms forming along their projected route. These were not unusual for the equatorial Atlantic at this time of year, but the storm cells were particularly intense, with cumulonimbus towers stretching high into the atmosphere. On board, however, there was no immediate cause for alarm. The aircraft's radar systems were capable of detecting and guiding them around the most dangerous pockets of turbulence. As the flight crossed the Brazilian coastline and entered the open Atlantic, Captain Dubois left the cockpit for his scheduled rest period. Confident in the abilities of his two co-pilots to manage the aircraft for the next few hours, Robert and Bonin assumed control, working in tandem with precision but also relying heavily on the autopilot. This was normal procedure on long-haul flights. Their primary role was to monitor instruments, check airspeed, altitude, heading, and fuel consumption, and maintain communication with air traffic control. But shortly after Dubois left, subtle signs of trouble began to emerge. An anomaly so small that it might have seemed insignificant to an observer but would ultimately set the stage for disaster. High above the Atlantic, at approximately 35,000 feet, ice crystals formed within the aircraft's pitot tube, small slender probes that measured the plane's airspeed. These tubes, crucial for feeding accurate speed information to the flight systems, suddenly became unreliable as ice blocked their tiny openings. The autopilot, dependent on correct speed readings to maintain stable flight, began to receive inconsistent data. Initially, the system tried to reconcile the readings, but within moments, the autopilot automatically disengaged. The sudden manual control of a fully loaded A330 in the dark over the vast Atlantic presented a critical challenge. Robert and Bonin, both competent pilots, were suddenly faced with conflicting instrument data. Airspeed readings jumped erratically between low and high values, leaving the co-pilots confused. In the calm isolation of the night sky, hundreds of miles from land, a small error in judgment could quickly escalate into a critical situation. As they attempted to interpret the instruments, First Officer Bonin made the first pivotal error. Misreading the airspeed indicators, he raised the nose of the aircraft slightly, attempting to maintain what he believed was optimal climb performance. This maneuver, seemingly minor, began to reduce the aircraft's forward airspeed. The principles of aerodynamics were unyielding. Lift depends not only on the angle of attack but also on airspeed. Slowing too much at high altitude increases the risk of a stall condition where the wings can no longer generate sufficient lift on the following minutes. The stall warning sounded intermittently. The cockpit voice recorder later revealed the confusion in real time. "What's happening?" Robert asked. Bonin responded, "I'm not sure. Speed looks funny." The tension in their voices, calm on the surface, masked a subtle undercurrent of concern. They were trained for emergencies, yet nothing in their experience had prepared them for the simultaneity of sensor failure, high-altitude flying, and storm turbulence, all while manually controlling a large commercial airliner. Despite the warnings, the pilot's response was not immediate or decisive. Instead of lowering the nose to regain safe speed, they hesitated, unsure whether the conflicting instruments could be trusted. Meanwhile, the aircraft began a gentle but accelerating climb, its nose rising higher as speed continued to drop. The autopilot remained offline, leaving the pilots solely responsible for maintaining control in conditions that would soon become extremely perilous to passengers. Asleep or quietly reading, were unaware that their aircraft was entering the early stages of a catastrophic sequence. Outside, the night sky was black, and the thunderstorm cluster loomed, massive and indifferent. The aircraft, designed to handle these conditions under proper control, was now dependent on human decision-making under stress, a combination historically known to magnify risk. As the aircraft climbed beyond 35,000 feet, the speed dropped further. The stall warnings became continuous, an audible alarm designed to trigger an immediate corrective action. The co-pilots now faced a terrifying paradox. The aircraft was climbing too high for the available airspeed, yet lowering the nose without knowing whether it was the correct response felt counterintuitive. In the span of a few minutes, the serene overnight flight transformed into a high-stakes crisis of judgment. The calm of the cockpit giving way to rising tension as reality of the malfunction began to register. By now, the airplane was operating in an envelope closer to its maximum certified altitude, where aerodynamic margin for error was minimal. The danger was no longer theoretical. In the distance, lightning flickered across the thunderstorm clouds, illuminating the aircraft's wingtips in brief, harsh flashes. Inside the cockpit, the two co-pilots were talking to each other and to Rio Control, trying to make sense of the instruments and the anomaly that had suddenly upended their routine. The first part of this flight was marked by gradual escalation, a sequence of small errors and technical issues stacking on top of one another. On its own, a pitot tube blockage might have been manageable. Combined with human hesitation, high altitude, and storm turbulence, it was a recipe for disaster. The calm, professional tone that had dominated the early part of the flight had shifted to uncertainty, a moment of vulnerability in the cockpit that would have profound consequences in the minutes to follow. At this stage, the pilots were still capable of recovery. Aviation training emphasizes handling unreliable airspeed indications, and procedures exist for such scenarios. Yet in the isolation of the night sky, with the aircraft hundreds of miles from any diversion airport and with the autopilot offline, the co-pilots faced an intense cognitive load. Decision-making slowed. Actions were delayed. Each second that passed increased the risk that the aircraft would move beyond the threshold of safe recovery. By 1:35 a.m., Flight 447 was poised on the edge of disaster. The aircraft was climbing, airspeed dropping, stall warnings sounding intermittently, and the first signs of panic began to emerge in the cockpit, voices captured on the recorder. This would mark the start of a sequence of misjudgments that, compounded by technical limitations and environmental conditions, would ultimately culminate in one of the most tragic and widely studied airline disasters in history. As Flight 447 continued its climb into the night sky, the situation in the cockpit shifted from concern to confusion. Airspeed readings remained unreliable, and the aircraft was now at approximately 35,500 feet. The co-pilots were fully aware that something was wrong, yet the proper corrective actions had not been initiated. In aviation, seconds can determine life or death, and in the isolation of the equatorial Atlantic, they had no margin for error. The aircraft, responding to the control inputs of First Officer Bonin, began a gradual but increasingly steep ascent. The nose pitched upward, and forward speed continued to decrease. The Airbus, designed to respond predictably to pilot commands, now hovered in a delicate balance between lift and stall. Outside, the storm clouds loomed larger, illuminated intermittently by flashes of lightning, as though nature itself were foreshadowing the impending disaster. "Speed's low." "Too low," Bonin said, his voice betraying a hint of urgency. "I'm watching it," replied Robert, his hands steady on the side stick. But in the darkness, with conflicting instrument readings, they could not accurately determine whether the aircraft was maintaining safe flight parameters. Then, almost immediately, the stall warning sounded not a brief chirp, but a loud, continuous alarm designed to demand immediate pilot action. The Airbus's fly-by-wire system was alerting them that the wings could no longer generate enough lift. In response, the aircraft automatically activated protections to prevent a stall, attempting to adjust pitch and reduce angle of attack. Yet human error overrode these protections. In their confusion, the co-pilots failed to recognize the necessity of lowering the nose to regain airspeed. The aircraft, now climbing toward 38,000 feet, began a high-altitude stall, a condition rare for commercial airliners, but extremely dangerous. Unlike a stall at lower altitudes, the thin air at cruising height left very little margin for recovery. Even minor delays in corrective action could render recovery impossible. The pitot tubes remained blocked, and airspeed indicators continued to fluctuate. Minutes passed, during which the pilots attempted to troubleshoot. They engaged in radio communication with air traffic control, seeking guidance, though the controllers themselves were unable to perceive the critical details of the situation. Flight 447, please confirm your airspeed, the controller asked. We're having issues with speed indicators, Bonin replied, his voice strained but calm on the surface. The understatement of his words belied the true danger. At that moment, the Airbus was beginning to descend in a stalled condition, its nose still raised, and forward momentum dangerously compromised. Captain Dubois, having returned to the cockpit after his rest, immediately recognized the severity of the situation. He took control, attempting to stabilize the aircraft. "We need to lower the nose," he said. "Gain airspeed now." But even with his intervention, the plane's descent into the stall continued. The co-pilots, still misreading instruments, made slight corrective inputs that exacerbated the pitch. For nearly 4 minutes, the aircraft oscillated, climbing and falling unpredictably as the pilots struggled to understand the stall dynamics at high altitude. During these crucial moments, the cockpit voice recorder captured the human side of the disaster: confusion, fear, and conflicting judgment. "I don't understand. We're falling," Bonin said. "We're losing it." Robert responded, his voice calm but tense. "Keep her steady. We can manage." Every second, however, brought the aircraft closer to the point of no return. The aerodynamic reality of a high-altitude stall is merciless. With the nose raised, lift diminishes while drag increases, further reducing airspeed. The aircraft's engines were working at full throttle, yet they could not overcome the lack of lift caused by the improper angle of attack. Even the most minor misjudgment was magnified exponentially. As the aircraft began its final descent toward the Atlantic, the pilots attempted a series of emergency procedures. They attempted to restore airspeed by gently lowering the nose, yet hesitated to push aggressively, fearing a sudden dive. They attempted to use the auxiliary power system to stabilize the engines, but at such high altitude, air density was too low to allow effective operation. Every procedure was constrained by the environmental limitations: thin air, high altitude, and storm turbulence. Below, the dark Atlantic stretched endlessly. No land, no visual reference points, only clouds, lightning, and the rhythmic thrum of the failing engines. The passengers, mostly asleep, were unaware that their aircraft was descending in a stalled condition. Controlled only by the diminishing skill of its crew and sheer luck, the aircraft descended further. At approximately 24,000 feet, the pilots realized that the engines were no longer producing the necessary thrust. Both engines had effectively failed due to the stall and loss of airflow. In a desperate attempt to regain control, Captain Dubois instructed the co-pilots to increase the rate of descent sharply, a counterintuitive move that would allow air to flow through the engines, potentially restarting them. However, execution was imperfect. The descent was insufficient, the engines remained locked, and the aircraft continued to lose altitude rapidly. Radio communication with air traffic control intensified as the crew tried to find a suitable diversion airport. Options were extremely limited. The aircraft was over the Atlantic, hundreds of miles from the nearest suitable runway. Any hope of reaching an airport had become slimmed at this point. The Airbus was effectively gliding, unpowered and unstable. The cockpit voice recorder captured a tense exchange. "Do you see any airports?" Dubois asked. "Nothing in range. We may not make it," Robert replied. Bonin added, "We need to prepare for a forced landing." The Airbus, a machine designed for controlled, stable flight, now relied entirely on human decision-making in an environment that offered almost no margin for error. The pilots attempted to locate landmarks, visual references to guide a crash landing attempt. Below, the storm clouds parted intermittently, revealing the vast expanse of ocean, and the glimmer of distant islands or ship lights, but nothing immediately useful for survival. Minutes passed in a tense, almost unbearable silence punctuated by brief bursts of frantic coordination. The aircraft was losing altitude faster than any controlled glide could allow. Every input had to be measured precisely, yet the combination of human fatigue, stress, and environmental complexity made exact control nearly impossible. Eventually, the Airbus descended to approximately 11,000 feet, still over open water. At this point, the crew had exhausted all reasonable emergency options. Any attempt to restart the engines would fail without sufficient airflow, and any attempt to glide to the nearest airport would exceed the aircraft's remaining altitude and distance capability. The realization of imminent disaster had set in. At 2:14 a.m., Air France Flight 447 finally struck the Atlantic Ocean at over 200 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic. The aircraft disintegrated on contact, scattering wreckage across a wide area. All 228 people on board were killed instantly, including passengers and crew. There were no survivors, only floating debris, and the silent, indifferent ocean, absorbing the wreckage of one of the most studied airline disasters in history. Investigators from the Bureau d'Enquêtes et d'Analyses pour la Sécurité de l'Aviation Civile B would eventually recover the flight data and cockpit voice recorders from the ocean floor. Nearly 2 years later, analysis revealed the tragic sequence of events: a temporary blockage of pitot tubes, misinterpretation of airspeed data by the co-pilots, improper stall recovery techniques at high altitude, and the compounding factor of environmental conditions. A combination of technical failure and human error had conspired to bring down the aircraft. On the aftermath, Air France and airlines worldwide revised training programs to emphasize high-altitude stall recovery, handling of unreliable airspeed indications, and decision-making under automation failure conditions. Flight 447 became a case study in aviation safety programs globally, a chilling reminder that even the most experienced pilots can fall victim to a combination of technical anomaly and human misjudgment. Air France Flight 447's story remains one of the most detailed and dramatic examples of modern aviation disaster. A perfectly routine overnight flight transformed into tragedy through a cascade of technical and human failures, highlighting the unforgiving nature of high-altitude flying and the critical importance of precise decision-making under pressure.